My name is Alia. I am the voice of what I lived, what I refused to let die with me, and what I chose to become instead of what others wanted me to be. When people hear my name, some whisper it with surprise, some with sympathy, and others with a bitterness that tells me as much about them as it does about me. Today I will tell you, plain, blunt, without adornment, what happened to me, how it broke me, how I buried the pieces, and how I lifted myself out of the ground where they tried to bury me. I was 5 the night my world shattered. The house had been full of ordinary noises, my mother humming in the kitchen, the soft clink of dishes, my father's small jokes that always seemed to make my mother laugh twice. And then one moment everything tipped, the screech of metal, the crash of glass, a scream that split the night. I remember the cold on the pavement, the strange bright sky long after sunset, the smell of smoke and fuel. My parents, my safe harbor, were taken from me in an instant, their faces frozen in a smile I would later learn to replay like a cruel photograph. They called it a miracle that I survived. I call it a wound I had to learn to carry. To live on after such a thing is not a reprieve. It is a contract with pain. Someone found me by the roadside, wrapped me in a blanket, and brought me to my uncle's home. There I was handed over to a life that had been planned and hollowed out before I could understand. My uncle, Ahmad, was kind in small ways, soft in speech, awkward in courage. He tried to love me in the way he could. But his wife, Fatima, she became the shape of the next wound. Fatima's face wore ordinary softness. Her eyes carried a cold, clinical indifference that cuts like winter wind. She would complain about how much I ate. She'd limit my food, limit my play, and give me more chores than any child should shoulder. If I cried, she'd say, "You are too sensitive." Her words were a domestic kind of cruelty, tiny, relentless. She kept me small. She made me feel that any desire I had was not mine to own. She turned the house into a quiet machine of commands and small humiliations. The other children, my cousins, learned the rules: look away, pretend you don't notice. They mirrored the household's mood, that slow freeze of compassion strangled at the source. There was, however, one warm light, my grandmother, Halima. She was soft as wool and fierce as a guardian. She mended things and hearts. Her hands smelled of cardamom and years. When she laughed, the whole house seemed clearer. When she scolded, the scold was sugar wrapped in medicine, harshness that healed. Grandmother gave me a place that was not stolen. She taught me to fold my hands, to hold my chin, and, perhaps without even intending it, to keep my dignity intact even when the world tried to press it out of me. When grandmother died, the crack inside me grew. She left me with a silence so heavy that for months I kept expecting to hear her humming in the next room. Her passing was a private apocalypse. Without her, the household's false order fell into a harder pattern of cruelty. Fatima tightened her hold. The cousins drifted further away. I was alone in a crowded house. By the time I was 15, I had learned something that childhood rarely teaches in soft tones: survival is not a passive thing. It is a decision. So I stepped into the world outside my home, into work. I found a place in a small restaurant, an unforgiving, honest world where hands and steam and fire measure a person much more fairly than some households do. I washed plates, swept floors, learned how to stand at a stove under a ceiling that did not judge me for being small. Nights were long. My back ached. My palms calloused. But each coin I folded and placed in a tin felt like arranging armor around my chest. I kept my promise to myself. I was not the sort of woman to trade time for bitterness. I saved, not for revenge that would scorch me, but for leverage, self-possession in the form of property, of work transformed into independence. I wanted a place that bore my name and my labor. A place that could not be ordered by anyone who thought themselves entitled to diminish. Me. 3 years of sacrifice, 3 years of learning the language of business as if it were another kitchen to master, and I bought the restaurant I had worked in. The same counters, the same holes in the floorboards that I'd tripped over in my first week there, now my keys fit the lock. I walked in, paid the rent with my own money, and sat at my own table. It was an ache and a redemption at once. The city noticed. People began to taste the food and the care we put into it. They noticed the way we named a plate after grandmother, how we gave a little more time and a little more grace to those who came hungry in more ways than one. But owning a place is not the same as being free. I understood a truth few people grant the wounded: revenge, if it consumes you, will not distinguish between your enemies and your soul. I wanted something else. I wanted justice. I wanted a correction that would leave me whole. So I shaped my intent. I would not lash out with the claws of hatred. I would build. The first weapon I chose was reputation. I wrapped my business in a quiet kindness. We offered free meals to orphan children. We created small scholarships in my grandmother's name. We hired young people who needed steady hands and a chance. I spoke about dignity the way my grandmother used to speak, simply. Slowly, the community began to listen. Goodwill is a kind of currency. It buys rights and deafens the arrogant. People who once barely spared me a glance now smiled when they saw me. When the neighbors began to whisper, they used my name the way one pronounces something worth protecting. Reputation alone would not topple Fatima's household. They were woven into the city through business ties and social assumptions. The second weapon I shaped was economic influence. I invested in suppliers, in nearby small shops, learning every cog of the supply chain. I tightened the knots of commerce to make them favor the fair and punish the reckless. When Fatima's husband's small business began to feel the pressure, less favorable contracts, tightened credit lines, the kind of paperwork that chokes the timid, no one could point to a single villain. Business shifts. Market preferences change. People make mistakes. But the damage was done. They had taught me to shrink. I had learned instead to grow in the only place they could not control, the marketplace of honest labor. As their financial footing trembled, social pressure mounted. I did not parade their failures. I amplified truth. I used events to raise questions, public conversations about children's rights, about the dignity of domestic workers, about the cost of silence. I told my story often, but never with the intention of shaming. My aim was to cast light. When people think, they watch. When they watch, choices become visible. Fatima found herself in a room full of faces that no longer flattered her the way they used to. She had always counted on the small polite silences of the neighborhood. Those silences evaporated, but I am not a prophet preaching from a mountaintop. I am a woman who learned the laws of courts as well as the laws of kitchens. Public sentiment nudged the doors open, but legal mechanisms hold the door wider. I consulted a lawyer, a careful man named Naveed. Swift action, he warned. Empty accusation has no legs. You must gather proof. Proof is the currency of courts. Testimony is the coin the courthouse will accept. So I became patient. I found people who had seen the small violences behind closed doors. A former helper who had left the household under duress wrote what she remembered. Neighbors, once reluctant, offered notes. Old friends of my grandmother confirmed the tenderness I'd been given and the deprivation I'd endured. The evidence assembled itself like mosaic tiles, a bruise here recorded in a clinic file. A note from a teacher who had seen me withdrawn. The testimony of someone who had been paid less than promised. Collecting proof was a quiet rebellion. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was careful paperwork and late-night conversations, and it was the most exhausting kind of bravery, sustained, administrative, ordinary. There was fear. There was the possibility of failure. There was the possibility that we would be told to forget and move on. But this was not about catharsis. This was about accountability. The law worked, sluggish as it is, when the facts are stubborn. Stubborn facts are patient, and so was I. When the legal processes came, they did not come as lightning strikes. They came as the grinding sound of justice taking shape. Investigations began. Questions were asked. Files were opened. The public began to look at once at the family that had kept me small, at the household that had taught its children to mock and its adults to stiffen. Fatima's distasteful control of the house, the favoritism she displayed, the verbal and physical belittlement she had normalized, these things became visible. I will not dress the next part in melodrama. I never enjoyed displaying another person's shame like a prize. If I had wanted mere humiliation, I could have taken less moral paths, but I chose a different route. At a community event I organized, I spoke about the orphaned, about dignity, about the things we do to children that we call discipline. I asked questions into the microphone that made people rearrange their assumptions. I did not name names. I asked for scrutiny of domestic cruelty. I suggested that if someone believed their children were minor masters of the household, that assumption should be challenged. Fatima sat at the back of the event, her face a map of small panic. The people who once paid her household deference were listening. Someone in the crowd remembered an old slanted remark. A former employee finally spoke to an investigative reporter. The net widened. When the law and the city's opinion combined, the pressure reshaped their lives. Their business lines suffered, their relationships strained. The boys, my cousins, found themselves on the other side of the conversation, confronted with what they had been taught. They could either repeat the cruelties they had been taught or find another way. Several of them chose awkward silence or avoidance. Others, later, chose the humiliation of apology. That is not something I can force. I can build structures that make change easier, but I cannot command the human heart. People must choose to become better. At one point, Fatima asked to meet me. The house that had been the theater of my small humiliations, I summoned its orchestrator to my table. Imagine, if you can, the woman who once withheld you from bread and sunlight, now shrinking in front of the very person she had tried to control. She came with a face that said something I had not earlier believed possible. She was sorry in the way that stops blaming others and starts naming guilt. I did not want a dramatic spectacle. I wanted truth. I told her plainly, I will not hold a sword over you and cut. I will offer you a condition: confess. Make public your harm. Work with us to care for those you once belittled. Let your hands that once ordered be the hands that serve. She agreed. She admitted. She joined, slowly, awkwardly, but she joined, the programs I ran for children, offering time, dull domestic work. And eventually, in a small, public ceremony, her acknowledgement. It would be dishonest for me to say this made everything right. Shame does not erase memory. Apology does not magically repair the years you lose as a child. But her admission sent a ripple through the community. It normalized accountability. People spoke about their own households differently now. And for me, it created a new kind of condition I had wanted from the beginning: the visible transformation of power, no one person allowed to prey on another. Community standards raising a hand when harm appears. What I had taken from all this was never simply revenge. I had taken control of the narrative of my life. I had taken a worn-out shame and turned it into a public lesson. I had given every coin I could spare to scholarships and training programs, not to wash my hands, but to make sure that no other child would take my path for granted. The restaurant that used to be a place to hide my hunger, now served as a place to nourish futures. I will tell you something few people expect to hear from someone they imagine as avenging. The last thing I wanted was to break someone down for the exhilaration of that break. One can destroy another and still be empty. I wanted instead to rebuild what the world had broken. I wanted to rebuild my dignity, and to build places where dignity could be given back. That was my revenge. It was public, it was lawful. And it was kind where it needed to be kind and unrelenting where it needed to be unrelenting. There were nights when I cried, nights when the memory of my parents' faces pulled at me so hard I could hardly breathe. Sometimes rage seared me raw. Sometimes despair called me to surrender. But I kept returning to the memory of my grandmother's hands, how she plucked mustard seeds from the ash and turned them into oil to heal our hands, how she would hold my chin and say, quietly, hold your head. Do not give them the sight of you bent. That was my law. It was small, yet it contained my entire strategy. Keep your head. Make a plan. When you are ready, act. And act so that you may leave the world a little more whole. When people ask me if I regret the path I took, a path of patience, of legal petitions, of community building, my answer is simple. Regret belongs to those who would have chosen cruelty. I regret the childhood lost, yes. I regret the small pieces of my life that I will never get back. But I do not regret that I chose to build rather than burn. I do not regret that my victory, when it came, was a gift that kept on giving. Each child who gets a scholarship, each young person who learns to cook and earn with dignity in my kitchen, each neighbor who can now name abuse, these are the things that make a victory real. I am often asked how I controlled myself. How I turned a crush of burning longing for retribution into something that could be steered, measured, and used. It is not a secret. It is discipline. I learned to direct emotion into work. I learned to read situations and people. I learned the currency of the city, how influence circulates, where reputations can be repaired and where they can be shattered through truth. I studied the law as if it were a recipe, one I could follow step by step with precise measurements, evidence, witness, documentation, patience. I made allies. I made friends. I made sure that the story people told about me was not the one my abusers wanted it to be. You might think I am being cold, calculating. Maybe I was. To survive I had to be. But I was also kind. There were times I helped my uncle, Ahmad, because he had always been gentle. The world made him timid, and I could not be purely punitive to someone who had tried, imperfectly, to do good. There were times I let a boy sit in my kitchen who had once ignored me in the house, and taught him a technique I knew would change his work forever. I suspect those gentled moments had more to do with my own healing than anything else. Power that is untempered by compassion becomes another chain. Power tempered by compassion becomes a tool. When it comes to Fatima's children, I cannot pretend they were villains by birth. They were taught to be indifferent. Confrontation forced them to look in the mirror. Some apologized awkwardly in time. Others remained distant. But the most important thing was that the line of permissibility had been redrawn. That is a legacy. They can choose to follow it or to break it. I have no authority to make them choose, only the community does that now, and the community prefers uprightness. I will close with an image you can carry. There was a day, I will never forget it, when an old woman came into my restaurant with her grandson. She had seen us on a morning program where we were giving out uniforms to a group of girls. She put her hand in mine and said, "This reminds me of my daughter." She told me she had always been friends with my grandmother. She told me that the food tasted like home to her. Her eyes were wet, but the light in them was steady. Later, I walked a child out to the street under a blanket we had wrapped around her shoulders. The child looked up at me and said, very plainly, "Thank you for teaching me a little bit of courage." That moment, an act that passed from hand to hand. Across years, felt like the true measurement of my life's work. So if you ask, was your revenge worth it? I will answer plainly. Yes. But not because someone was humiliated in the end. Yes, because the outcome allowed me to undo a small portion of the harm that had been done to others. Because it turned my fury into a ladder rather than a weapon. Because it taught an entire neighborhood that a child's dignity is not a household secret to be hoarded but a public trust to be protected. I am not naive. I know harm exists still, in other corners, in other homes. My story is not a universal remedy. But if one girl hears my voice and decides that the proper path is not to destroy or be destroyed but to strengthen and to transform, then my life has become a useful thing in the world. You may be thinking, at this point, that I am recounting a tidy moral. The truth is it's messy. The truth is there were nights I could not sleep. The truth is there were days I thought of quitting, of sliding back into quiet servitude and letting the world keep its pretenses. But I did not. I held to the shape of my grandmother's hands in my memory, and to the whispered vow I made as a child, to be my own guardian. If you are someone who has been told you are nothing, hear me, you are not nothing. You can build. Build slowly. Build with courage and with witnesses. Gather the small evidences of your life. Learn the language of law and commerce if you must. Make allies. Make art of your labor. Let your survival become a program that outlasts your pain, and if you imagine revenge as a bright flash, a purge of blood and fury, I would ask you to imagine it another way, as a sustained, quiet process of aligning your life so that those who would keep you small find no hold. Let your victory be one that feeds others. Let your triumph be one that creates opportunities instead of crushing people. That is what I did. That is how I turned my wound into a workbench. I told you my story not to be pitted, not to be celebrated like a spectacle, but so that you would know the routes out of darkness are more than one. Mine was a path of dignity. It required old-fashioned virtues, patience, discipline, honesty, and service. It also required strategic smarts and the refusal to be hurried by impulse. Above all, it required the ability to keep your own heart safe while you sought to open the doors for others. My name is Alia. I was small once. I am not small now. I am, instead, a woman who chose the harder victory, the one that leaves the world better than she found it. If you remember nothing else from my voice, remember this: the kind of revenge that lasts is the kind that restores, not only to you, but to others who deserve a chance. Thank you for listening.